sublime is both an aesthetic category that structures philosophical thought about aspects of human and also non-human being, and it is a structuring affect as well, something that co-creates human sociality, like mourning, anger, or effervescence. It relies on an interaction with a sublime object, and thus necessarily exists in what Merleau-Ponty calls the ecstatic encounter of human and other. So in this paper, I take up writings on the sublime in continental philosophy as well as in postmodernism in order to ask what phenomenology might have to contribute to such thought. While phenomenologists have not written on the sublime in any concerted way, I suggest that a phenomenological approach to the sublime contributes not only to the way we understand human cognition, but also to the small but emerging literature on the phenomenology of affect. That is, the way shared feeling mobilizes and co-creates forms of human subjectivity, both individual and collective. I sketch out a theory of what I'm calling the auditory sublime, a sublime produced through listening. Unlike the sublime of the Romantic era, evoked through the majesty and terror of visual distance, the auditory sublime is based on an experience of aesthetic proximity. Whether sublimity arises in relation to a visual object or an auditory one has important repercussions, not only for the experience of the sublime, but also for the work, that it does in the world, thus bearing upon ethics. In the larger work, I illustrate what I call the aesthetics of proximity in two examples. In the emergence of experimental music in the United States in the 1970s to the present, with its use of drones and proximate intervals and the overtones that they produce, and Sufi sounds of lament and worship that I've recorded and experienced over the last 3 decades almost in Morocco and France. Here I limit myself to the second case. But first, a short excursion into the sublime. Do we need the sublime as an aesthetic category? What does a phenomenology of the sublime help us understand about human subjectivity and the way it is constructed over and against the concept of nature and the non-human? For Edmund Burke, writing in the early and mid-18th century, the sublime arose from a moment when man confronted the magnitude of nature and was humbled by the experience. The off-cited example is Turner's painting, landscape painting of a man looking out across a range of huge mountains. Proximity to the sublime object provoked terror, fear, even danger and pain. And it was only distance, Burke asserted, that allowed these registers of emotion to transmute into awe, appreciation, and sometimes delight. At the end of the 18th century, Kant distinguishes between the beautiful, which had form and boundary, and the sublime, which was formless and boundless. The sublime, he thought, could only be known conceptually, since its magnitude precluded a phenomenal experience of its totality. Here, it resembles what Timothy Morton has called a hyper-object, an object so big that it is only known in intimate and partial encounters like radioactivity as it falls on one's cheek in a raindrop. Kant's sublime is purely conceptual because it exceeds the faculties of the human sensorium. For Kant, the supersensible cannot be represented, but can be known in human presentiment, that is, through intuition, a form of affective knowledge or gnosis. While he does not develop a theory of the emotions, Kant does intimate that there are ways of knowing beyond the rational or intellective. Like Burke before him, however, Kant returns to the visual metaphor in his insistence that it is only distance from the sublime that allows for human apprehension and appreciation. Schopenhauer, who I adore, follows Kant in dividing the sublime into the dynamic and the mathematical, the former posing a physical threat to the human, the latter a psychological one. For Schopenhauer, however, the sublime is distinguished from beauty insofar as the state of sublimity makes humans conscious. It makes humans conscious of two things: of the separation of the intellect from the will, and conscious that human perception is not always in service to that will, a state that produces a kind of exaltation. We've all experienced this. And here the will is the evolutionary will, it's not the egoistic one. The sublime relies upon a consciousness of consciousness, a waking up of the machine to its own workings. It is relevant that Schopenhauer finds music to provide humans with the highest form of aesthetic experience, and this because it carries a non-linguistic abstract knowing similar to what we might call sound knowledge, that is, a non-intellective gnosis facilitated by listening, through which humans intuit the world. Sound is not always sublime, but when it is, it vibrates the organism into consciousness of itself. Schopenhauer does not separate human nature so much as note that the evolutionary will that drives both sentient and non-sentient striving causes suffering for humans, and this suffering can only be mitigated in three ways. 1, by aesthetics and art. 2, by compassion. 3, by a kind of detachment from desires of embodied existence. And in this, he was very much like a Buddhist. Schopenhauer brings us closer to a phenomenology of the sublime, since unlike Kant, he acknowledged what he variously called intuitive cognition. I won't try to pronounce these in German. Intuitive cognition, knowledge of perception, or feeling. What's more, we, humans, share this kind of cognition with animals. Schopenhauer's aesthetic theory does not rely on a man against nature trope. To the contrary, the capacity of humans to be present to the thing itself without the egoistic strivings of evolution happens only with nature and with art, and not against them. It is a will-less perception, unrelated to the strivings of the ego and its evolutionary drives. And in this sense, it is a form of Islam, which means submission. The sublime, at least in continental philosophy, has a relation to limens and to the terror and awe they provoke. Indeed, the etymology of the word sublime stems from the Latin sublimus, up to the limens. But it is not the limens themselves, but cognizance of them that produces terror or horror, as Kristeva notes in her discussion of objection. And I'm going to push Kristeva a little more in subsequent versions of this. The ethics of proximity and distance. In the 21st century, proximity and distance are once again terms of philosophical discourse. Academic and theoretical emphases emerge, of course, from social contexts and political movements, right? And with the current rise in social upheavals, need I go through the litany of the Arab Spring, wars in Syria, Yemen, refugees in Europe, the clash of secular and sacred worlds, racism in the United States and elsewhere, economic and ecological crises, as well as global warming. It is not surprising that social theorists and philosophers have turned to ethics as the pertinent philosophical landscape. Judith Butler, for example, discusses the way what she calls human suffering at a distance implicates the witness in a non-consensual relationship, one she calls an unwilled ethical encounter, instigated by mediated images and discourses of human misfortune. We can think of Susan Sontag's work here on visual witnessing of the pain of others as well. She draws upon Levinas's ideas of face, as well as Arendt's discussion of the right to belong, in order to chart what she calls, Butler, the obligations of proximity, an ethical relation to the stranger resulting from a kind of reversibility of distance and proximity in human relations. The provocations for ethical action, in Butler's thought, are distant, but the actions inspired are proximate. And yet, she notes, that visual and linguistic translation are what make ethical responses to distant suffering possible. So here we have a reiteration of the visual and discursive bias of the Romantic era. For Judith Butler, it is the changed human relation to proximity and distance that characterizes the contemporary moment. The relations forged through visually witnessing the suffering of others at a distance in mediated images creates, she asserts, ethical relations of engagement that did not exist in prior times. Do these ethical relations at a distance take precedence over more proximate embodied relations, what I have been calling body proxima? Are they beautiful? Are they sublime? Following Butler, I suggest that the relations of the human to the sublime are also reversible. That is, when proximity, not distance, becomes the site of sublimity, then a phenomenology of affect rests in oral and not in visual knowledge, though we might revise that to say in the proximate senses, maybe not just sound, but in the more proximate senses. So what are the aesthetics of proximity? In this, I welcome your thoughts about all of this, but before the ineffable, the terrible, the sublime, one trembles. I'm going to suggest that this is not accidental, but rather an aesthetic property of the sublime itself. Lyotard attributes it to the impossibility of representing the sublime, its excess and unboundedness. It is the meeting with the ineffable that causes affective friction, whether in the terror and awe of great magnitude or in intimate encounters. Proximity with the sublime object produces trembling, like two differently charged magnets that create energy in repulsion, or, contrariwise, like the energy produced by the melding or union of two bodies in a touch that is never quite touch, but rather a friction of molecules meeting. It is a vibrational response of the perceiving apparatus becoming aware of itself perceiving, always in a relation to another. A kind of Whiteheadian flip into consciousness. It's a kind of aesthetic of mesh, again to invoke Timothy Mourning. When this takes place at a distance, the friction must rely on visuality, whether standing before a range of mountains, a raging storm, or the mediated images of the horrors of war. Proximity, however, relies on an additional bodily response. It necessarily entails relations that are not only speculative and imaginative, but also based on tactile embodied relations, body proxima. So we assert, that for empathy to enter the realm of ethics, physical proximity is required. For empathy to enter the realm of ethics, physical proximity is required. But what do the aesthetics of proximity sound like? In the realm of sound, this is often experienced as dissonance, as notes in proximity, for example. So I'm going to play you this. It may be completely out of context, though I gave you the context in the longer paper. So I'm hoping it makes sense. This is a Sufi worship ceremony, dhikr or zikr ceremony. Not the best recording, but notes in proximity. I'm not going to analyze that for you. I will afterwards if there's time. I'm going to return to the paper. Cognitive scientist Douglas Hofstadter notes that I remain primarily myself because most of our perceptual input comes from our own perceptual hardware, my body. The sensorium that has been shaped by culture, a time period, a religion, a language, a habitus. What's more, according to Damasio, past emotional experiences get reactivated, becoming somatic markers, in his words, and only allow context-consistent behavior to pass through, unquote. In a sense, determining our future experiences. This is profound. This is profound. It means I can only hear things I'm used to hearing, feel things I'm used to feeling, understand things I'm used to understanding. This is what keeps us in our little worlds and prevents us from understanding or even knowing that there are others. To break out of those self-perpetuating patterns, I assert, humans create experiences of radical encounter with difference through the sublime. At least that's one way. I'm not saying it's the only way. It's one way. So what does it mean for the sublime to be as close as one's breath and yet a part of another's? Finding the sublime in sound reverses the relations of proximity and distance attributed to this experience by Burke, Kant, and others. While it affirms their insights that the sublime produces a meta-consciousness, a perceiving subject conscious of itself perceiving, it is, like Schopenhauer suggests, not a state of egoistic separation, but one that finds itself in intra-relation to the sublime object. In the case of the voice, that object is both within the self and apart from the self, thus embodying the paradox of being singular and plural. But one need not produce sound in order to experience the sublime. It is also possible to be a sublime listener, and that is what Schopenhauer had in mind when he noted that music was the highest of arts. I'm going to rush through the next page, because I have 2 minutes. Merleau-Ponty teaches that the null point of human perception is the self. Looking out from my eyes, I see you, but I need you to see and reflect myself back to me in language, gesture, empathic response in the eyes of the face. Perhaps this is why Levinas emphasizes the bonds that such human-to-human and very visual encounters create. And yet the boundaries of the self are not fixed. They do not stop at the skin, but extend out like rays of affective and energetic feeling, what Anzieu, if I understand him correctly, calls the sonorous envelope. The self is a node in an invisible but very present matrix of relations in which consciousness and self-consciousness appear as a blinking lighthouse in an otherwise dark sea. Notions of conscious self-making necessarily arise from collectivities that are unevenly self-aware, for whom intention may take a backseat to affective ties and mutual recognition. The self arises in struggles with the forms of being it inherits, that is, its habitus, in art and self-fashioning, just as collectivities, like academic collectivities, arise in struggles with the past. If the romantic sublime was based upon the distance of magnitude, the auditory sublime is based on the proximity of intimacy, a microscope instead of a telescope. Unlike Kant's notion of the sublime, a more proximate and intimate experience of the sublime is produced through the ear, and in particular through listening. Attending to this form of the sublime does more than just substantiate the aesthetics of proximity and distance are qualitatively different now than they were in the 19th century. It also locates ethical action in the phenomenal local, that is, in the body, knowing that the body does not stop at the skin, but is attached with innumerable invisible and affective threads to others, sentient and non. An encounter with limens produces terror, awe, rapture. In short, forms of consciousness that take humans out of their everyday existence and demonstrate a beyond of knowing through the there of listening. While Butler may be correct in positing the shifting relations of distance and proximity at this moment, I caution against the idea that ethics can be maintained in distal relations to other bodies. Aesthetics that are proximate are ultimately aesthetics that are transformative on all scales of magnitude. So I just want to go over the 4 points really quickly that I've kind of touched on or hope to go further with. 1, in the auditory sublime, relations of magnitude shift. The limens encountered are proximate and sonic and effectively make the listener conscious of her perception, as well as the connection and reliance upon the sublime object, which may be sound. It is a form of oral gnosis, or sound knowledge. 2, it is these proximate relations that create empathy. My life depends on yours because it exists within yours and cannot be separated from it. 3, empathy is the first step in effective ethical relations, not intellective empathy at a distance, but experienced intra-relations. For this, bodies must be proximate. Visual empathy at a distance is less effective, not completely, it's not that distal empathy is not effective, but it is less effective at social transformation. 4, the aesthetics of proximity have a sound. It's the sound of lemons touching. We find this aesthetic in experimental music, in lament, in worship. We can associate it with microtonalities, dissonance in some cultures, though dissonance is different, has different definitions. And often with aesthetic, we often associate it with aesthetic discomfort. The Sublime does this work in the world. It wakes us up, it disintegrates patterns that keep us in ruts of overdetermined perceptual self-replication. And I think ethnography does this too. In displacing the human from the center of experience, the Sublime puts ways of being before ways of knowing, enacting unexpected intimacies that confound rational understanding, insisting rather upon an aesthetic pedagogy, going back to yesterday, that we might refer to as being with paradox. How conceptions of the auditory sublime will explicitly inform a phenomenology of affect, I hope to understand soon. Thank you very much.